States. And what I have in the back of my mind is an argument that's been advanced by Richard Alba and Nancy Honer that religion serves a function in these two places somewhat differently in terms of immigrant integration. They've suggested that religion is, in the United States, a bridge to integration. In other words, it assists integration. Whereas in Europe, it's something of a impediment or a barrier. Bridges and barriers. And what I want to do is suggest that maybe as an overstated notion based on sort of what we know, sort of the state of the field is today, so I'm kind of reporting on secondary literature. Now, and so much of the focus will be on, I'll do a little bit of comparative stuff with early on here, but as you'll see, the focus is on things that are happening in Europe. Very clearly, Islam factors largely into this conversation. Although Islam is not the only religion that is, as you'll see near the end of the talk, in which some of the issues that I'm going to raise are a matter of concern. But one of the things that has happened in the last, say, 25 or 30 years is that many immigrants that were once seen primarily as, say, immigrants from Morocco or Pakistan are now seen as Muslims. In other words, a national or an ethnic identity has been sort of superseded by a religious identity. And what they're entering into is a world that has been historically predominantly Christian, both in Europe and North America. And in both places, there has been a historical struggle to wrestle with the reality of religious pluralism. And almost every conversation or every study that you see on this topic mentions at some point or another the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which was an effort to try to find some sort of religious peace. Now, and what it did is it set the stage for a legitimation, is it dark in this room? Legitimation of religious pluralism. That was a very, very limited kind of pluralism, but it has evolved over time into a growing kind of political secularization. And there are two aspects to political secularization. One has to do with the differentiation of spheres, of institutional spheres in society, so the political and the religious end up being divorced from each other, just as the economy does and just as the civil sphere does. But the other is that there's an increasing body of law that is intended to protect religious minorities and to promote religious pluralism. That's political secularization. Linked to this, also in the West, a long historical process, and some think that the way this has played out in the United States is fundamentally different or profoundly different than in Europe, but perhaps that's not quite the case. But what I'm talking about is cultural secularization, which is the retreat of religion from sort of everyday life of people. Now, what some people argue is that this is in fact characteristic of Europe, to a large extent. But the United States remains a remarkably religious country. Now, in terms of political socialization, there's an interesting book by a Turkish scholar named Ahmet Kur, in which he distinguishes between two kinds of political secularism. One he refers to as assertive, and the other as passive. And his prime example of assertive is France, and his prime example of passive is the United States. And what it really has to do with is the role played by the state. In the United States, our understanding of the relationship between the political and the religious is formulated in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the so-called Disestablishment Clause, which simply says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's construed as a passive Whereas what you have in France, and there's a long history from the French Revolution up to 1905, where you have a much more contentious battle between religious, and especially Catholicism, religion, and secular forces. And you end up in 1905 with a law that tries to, in effect, sort of make peace between these warring factions, which creates a kind of secularism that looks at some level to be more radical than the secularism in the United States. But in some strange ways, it isn't, because, as it turns out, the French state owns religious property, right, which is not the case in the United States, and protects it. That has to do with the way in which these two warring factions kind of found some kind of common ground at that time. I would argue that the French model, this assertive model, is something characteristic of many countries in Europe. And what it really comes down to is that in many places in Europe, continental Europe in particular, the state has been prepared to play a more assertive role in matters religious. Okay? In the United States, there's been an effort to keep some distance between government and religion, and that seems to be this, right? And partly this has to do with two different versions of, or models of democratic practice. The Lockean model, you know, if you think of the philosophical, in the case of the American context, and Rousseau, which you see really most explicitly in France, but I think it kind of percolates into other countries. Of course, it gets more complicated in some countries that still have established state churches, like Britain or some of the Nordic countries. But even there, you find ways in which there's an effort to try to accommodate. So, for example, Tarek Madoud thinks that having state religion in Britain is not an impediment to a multicultural understanding of religion. And he takes heart, he cites in a couple of his publications, a comment that Prince Charles has made over time, which he says that he, instead of desiring to be the defender of faith, he argues he wants to be the defender of faith writ large, rather than the defender of faith. Okay, so in other words, a further appreciation of pluralism, even in a place that privileges one particular religion in some fashion. All right. In many respects, Islam has been sort of front and center in these debates in recent years, and that has to do with an argument that oftentimes is made that somehow by critics, by people who are fundamentally opposed, either they're opposed to Islam or they're opposed to immigrants or some combination thereof. But the argument is that somehow this religion proves to be an impediment, this particular religion proves to be an impediment to integration. There are a couple of people who've written, I think, important works that help kind of clarify the situation on the ground. One of them is a person named Jonathan Lawrence, who argues that one of the things that you need to realize about Muslim immigrants in Europe is that they came at a moment, at a time in which they were perceived to be, and they perceived themselves to be at times, temporary workers. So the idea was that they would come during the rebuilding of Europe after the war, they would come, they would work, and they would return home. And so there was, at some level, no felt need on the part of these societies to integrate these people into their respective nations. Right? And instead, that job went to, they assumed it, the sending nations. Actually, what Jonathan Lawrence argues is there were, he calls this embassy Islam. And it actually says there are two versions of it. One is that specific countries played a role in, they send imams, they would help fund the religious practice and so on. And Moroccans, for example, Turks, they were doing this, you could say, if you wanted to be charitable, you could say they were doing this in order to provide for the religious needs of their immigrant population, But probably a more realistic understanding of this is they were seeking to control the population that they assumed would return. And not only did nations do this, but Lawrence points out then there were some sort of pan-national efforts, and the Saudis and the Pakistanis in particular played a significant role in this. All right. Countering that, what emerged was what he calls political Islam. And this was an Islam that was sort of more grassroots by dissidents who were oftentimes exiles, political refugees, who, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood, who found a base in Europe where they would be free from the control of their countries of origin, and they competed with this embassy Islam. Okay. This was the situation for some time, as this expectation that these were temporary migrants. Okay. In more recent decades, and Lawrence I think dates this to the 1990s, when the realization has started to take hold that in fact these aren't so temporary. This is the second and third generations now living in these countries. There's been an effort to try to create for European states to play a role in shaping Islam. And in an effort, and the French in particular are explicit about this, what they want to create is a French Islam. Okay, an Islamic practice that is consonant with the values and the lifestyles of people in France. And to that end, they have promoted, and one of the things that Lawrence points out is that this seems to be something that is uniform across countries in continental Europe. They've created, for example, in ways that aren't seen as threatening. Now, this is something that's quite different. The United States doesn't really have anything that approaches this. There are differences in terms of how this plays out, and in the interest of time, I won't. But Lawrence, for example, has some very interesting discussions about differences between what's happening in France and in Germany. And if you think about certain things like the headscarf debates, which they have been more intense in France than in Germany. Exactly why that is, he and a few other people, including Christian Young and John Torpy, I think provided some interesting insights here. So there's on the one hand there's evidence of kind of convergence. On the other hand, there's evidence of national contexts still meaning something. And what I want to do is locate this briefly in terms of claims to understand exactly what it is. Because one of the things that, for example, certainly I see this in the United States, one of the things that critics of Islam will argue is that they're trying to create a kind of separate identity divorced from the larger society, trying to impose Islamic laws and so on. In fact, what you'll see, I think, if you look at this in terms of multicultural claims making, what you'll see is something quite different. And what I'm going to do is just briefly, I've written an article a couple of years ago on multiculturalism as a form of claims making. And what I argue is that there are 5 types of claims that are made by minority groups of one kind or another. One I call exemption. And what I mean by exemption is as the term suggests, there's a request to be exempt from certain laws or policies or practices. Okay, so a non-Islamic example, Sikhs in Canada have, and in Britain have sought to be exempt from people who ride motorcycles have sought to be exempt from having to wear helmets because the helmets don't work for the okay. All right, accommodation is a second form, and accommodation is like exemption, only it doesn't necessarily require state intervention, which is the case with if you're going to be exempt from laws. But for example, an employer accommodating Muslim workers who can keep a call to prayer, okay, but finding some kind of way of mutually accommodating. Okay, all right. The other two there are three others, but two are significant. One is called redress and the other preservation. Both of those are to make greater demands on the host society, including policies of affirmative action and so forth. Neither of those are claims that you'll find coming from immigrant groups, including religious groups or promoting their own interests. So the more radical kinds of claims making are not found here. They're found among indigenous people and ethno-national minorities, but not among other people. And the final claim is a claim for inclusion, okay? Which just seems like an odd thing to argue that, because people often see multiculturalism as finding space to be separate and distinct. But I would argue that in the process of doing this, there's also an effort to try to be included in the larger society. And I'll sort of stop since I was giving a warning here. Suffice it to say that the kinds of claims that have emanated from Muslim communities in North America and in Western Europe are all of the exemption and accommodation variety. And so, for example, certain slaughtering practices, having sections of cemeteries set aside for Muslim burials and so on and so forth. But in the process, there's an effort to try to see Islam as having a place in the larger pantheon of religions in a nation that is respected and seen on equal footing. Okay, so I'll stop with that.